Manchester's indie rock and roll station, XS Manchester. The XS Manchester Long Player, an iconic album in full with Jim Salveson. XS Manchester.
Welcome to the XS Long Player, another classic album delved into with one of the people at the centre of that album. On this episode, I discuss an album I absolutely love, but also an album I appreciate that not everyone will be massively familiar with, because I guess it was kind of underground when it came out in 2006. It would have been played on a few indie radio stations at the time, but certainly you wouldn't class it as mainstream, despite the fact it sold tens of thousands of copies and went silver within a few weeks of release. I'm talking about the debut album from Get Cape, Wear Cape, Fly, Chronicles of a Bohemian Teenager, and for today's show I'm talking to Sam Duckworth, aka Get Cape. This is a really cool chat with Sam in which he discusses the anger under the surface on this album, why he didn't go into a studio like Rockfield to create it and instead chose to do some of it in bare-bones studios or even his bedroom, and how he feels about the album now as he looks back 15 years on from its release. If this isn't an album you're massively familiar with, then I can 100% recommend giving it a listen. There is a Spotify link to the album in the podcast description, so go and have a click on that. Go and have a listen before we delve into this, because Sam references a few songs on that album, and it would help if you knew the songs before you listen. But enjoy this. Sam Duckworth, aka Get Cape, Wear Cape, Fly, talking about his debut album, Chronicles of a Bohemian Teenager. Get Cape, Wear Cape, Fly, aka Sam Duckworth. How you doing?
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. Can I call you Sam for this rather than Get Cape? Is that all right?
Of course it is.
You don't feel like you're being told off by your mum when you're referred to by your full name or anything like that?
Well, it's very rare that people will full name me when it comes to the band.
Good stuff. Right, we're going to be looking back at your album, The Chronicles of a Bohemian Teenager, tonight, which came out back in 2006. And I was actually surprised it did come out in 2006. Just ticked over its 15th birthday. Caught me off guard a little bit because I remember the album coming out. It doesn't feel like 15 years ago. Does it feel like 15 years ago for you?
I think for a whole generation of people that got into music in 2006, 15 years has completely crept up on us and taken us by surprise. I don't think it was just me with this album, and I think there's quite a lot of other records that came out in that time. We're like, wow, it's 15 now.
Yeah.
It's flown by. I'm still grateful to be making music, grateful to be talking about this album 15 years on. You know, I think that's something that also has taken me by surprise, is that it's flown by and people still love it.
There's been some celebrations around the birthday recently. It was released on gold vinyl for the 15th anniversary. There were some gigs planned, but as with most gigs this year, they've been pushed back to next year. But I guess that's caused you to go back and have a look at this album again with that 15-year breathing space. Has your relationship changed over the course of a decade and a half?
Well, what's interesting is that the label that I put the record out couldn't find, let's put it this way, the artwork masters for the record.
Okay.
So when it came to repressing it, it was a full top-down rebuild. So I got in touch with Jez, who's the guy that did the artwork 15 years ago, and dug through the archives. So it was actually a really good opportunity to look back on 15 years of my career and in the run-up to the repress. And then obviously, it was only 2 or 3 weeks before the tour that the shows got moved. So I was also musically quite ready for it. So it's interesting. It's a perfect time to do this, really, because it's not that I haven't thought about it, but it's that I haven't really listened to it or analysed it. I thought I was, I guess songs evolve over time. They evolve in your set. And I thought I knew it quite well, but then I listened back to it and I was like, okay, yeah, this is different. So yeah, it's been a really good time to celebrate the fact that, you know, first album has, you know, allowed me to continue making music for 15 years. That was always my ambition, so I'm grateful to be in that position. But yeah, just, you know, real proper walk back down memory lane was fascinating.
It feels like a very personal album when you listen to it. And what does that feel like being 15 years older? Because I've talked about this before with people, particularly when they've written albums from the heart or albums when they're very young. The songs are almost like diary entries. And I know that if I had a diary that I'd written 15 years ago or when I was younger, I would not want to be looking back at those entries without breaking myself in half cringing. How does it feel? I mean, from the outside looking in, it doesn't feel like that. But when you look at the words you were writing and the songs you were creating at that time, is that part of you that wishes you could go back and do them again?
Not in the slightest, to be honest. Like, lyrics have always been a big deal to me. has been something that I've really cared about. And I'm very aware that the songs that I'd write when I'm 20 are not going to be the songs that I write when I'm 35. One of the things that's a real joy to be in the studio working with new artists is you really, well, artists of all different ages, to be honest, is you realise how much you pick up along the way. There are bits where I'm like, oh, I'd do that differently. But on the whole, I try to, even with the personal stuff, I try and wrap a little bit of third party, poetic license into it, because I guess at the time, listening to a lot of, emo music or political music, I was aware that if it was going to be part of my catalogue, I'd need to feel like I'd be comfortable singing it as an adult, not just as a teenager. But to be honest with you, I think we all look back on our photos and our memories from, when we were in our late teens, early 20s. And a lot of it's fond and a lot of it's like, oh, I'm glad I learned that, or I'm glad this is not like that now. I think it's actually quite nice to have those kind of referential yardsticks on in my set that I play, because it reminds me that, that kind of, I don't know, sometimes instinct gets confused with naivety, and it's okay sometimes to just think that, the world doesn't have to be so overly complex or poetic. And I think that it's a nice reminder that sometimes the best way to say something in a song is just to tell it how it is. And I think that this album certainly got big elements of that to it.
Let's go back to the making of the album. And I understand this is a very homemade album. It was recorded in your bedroom. So take me back there. If I was sitting on your bed alongside you making this album, what would I be able to see? What's around you at this time?
Well, I think that, I don't know whether it's marketing or a bit of a myth. Like, I think there's a couple of things that, it was certainly a DIY album. Me and a couple of friends who had have a studio, it was, at the time it was in Letchworth, Garden City. It was like basically a car lock up there and converted into a studio by Andy and Adam Mensch, who in a band called Bohemian Diamond Industry, and Andy was drumming for me in the band. And I think sometimes, there's so much romance around bedroom records, but everyone's still trying to make it sound as good as they can. I think that what's interesting about this record is that the first EP and 4 of the songs made the album really were bedroom. It's Guy Chris, he had a little setup in his bedroom in Tolsbury in North Essex and kind of recorded the EPs then. And the original plan was for none of the EP tracks to make the album. The EP tracks being Get Cake, Wear Cake, Fly, Glass Houses, I Spy, and it has been 15 years. I can't remember the fourth one. It will come to me. That's so funny. I thought
I can hear you Googling.
That's how long this video. Yeah, you can hear me Googling it because, I'm actually on Spotify because, that's going to be the best place for me to it's going to be much better than my memory, clearly. So there were 4 tracks that are on the very first EP. Whitewash's Brainwash is the other one, of course. It's the first song on it. So they were bedroom. So very primitive versions of Logic when you still had to use a dongle to use it. You could probably use like 12 channels of audio max before the whole thing melted down. So we took some of those stems, we did some of those bits, and then it was super hot. And I remember there being a World Cup on, and we moved the studio at one point to Adam's dad's front room because it was the only place that we could get any oxygen. But, we were passionate about the idea of learning and working out how to make records. I think that there's a natural curiosity that comes from artists that love to explore things and also love listening to electronic music to really want to learn more about the studio process. We're going to bin those tracks off, and then we did I Spy as a B-side for Call Me Ishmael. And everybody's like, what are you doing? You should just put those out. And in the end, that ended up being a double A side rather than a B side. And then all conversations about who to do the record with were kind of like, well, they were just like, do you guys just want to get on with it? And I'm like, yes, please. We were able to do it in a way that was comfortable for us, in a way that we wanted. It didn't necessarily feel like it had that overarching pressure of a major label recording process. You felt the presence of the label, but mostly left to get on with it.
Do you think you missed anything because you weren't involved in that? You weren't like stuck doing a residency at Rockfield or anything like that. You didn't have that big walking into a studio, guitar under your arm, this is your debut album moment. Do you feel like you missed anything? You missed a part of your, musical life because of not having that moment?
I probably missed out on some anecdotes more than I missed out on experiences, if I'm honest. Like, I've been grateful and fortunate to be in some amazing studios, but for me, recording records is as much about process as it is about sound. And I don't know, like the big residential get away from environment. My records are like, I've only really learnt this since probably looking back on Chronicles, actually. They're so intrinsically linked to the environment that they're written in.
Right.
You know, I do as much of my writing as I'm walking about looking at stuff as I do when I'm with an instrument in my hand. You know, I've always been on the principle of like, you kind of work out what it is you want to do. And then when you play, you just join the dots. So I think if, you know, maybe one day I'll make an album about how beautiful the countryside is. But until then, I feel like, you know, my words are influenced by, you know, urban environments. And also the spirit of Get Cape's always like, try and do as much as you can, as best as you can with the resources that you have. And I feel that, you know, I was fortunate to get the opportunity to make a big record for my second album, you know, with my favorite producer, with an orchestra, and, you know, do something quite, I guess, unexpected in comparison to the first. So I don't feel like I missed out on any experiences. I just, sometimes I think that you should grow to those points. So you really know, like when you're a band, maybe fine, you got to play in the same room and stuff. But, you know, we were completely excited by computers and technology and fusing those two things. And I've been in enough sessions in recent times where it's an aux cable plugged into a massive mixing desk to go, well, maybe it was the right call.
I want to go back to the technology stuff in a moment, actually. But before we do, you might have already answered my next question in a roundabout way, because now the timeline's slightly confused when I was looking at it, so I can't quite work out what happens where. But I think you would have been writing this album and creating it whilst you were touring and playing gigs around the country. And you kind of got a bit of a reputation when you were playing these gigs for getting up close and personal with fans, going out with them after gigs, sleeping on floors. Do you think that helped you understand the audience that you were writing for when you were creating this album? The fact that you were there in the crowd doing things with your audience?
Yeah, I don't think anything's changed, to be honest. I mean, obviously, at the moment, it's a very different backdrop. And I think that's partly why the tour needed to be moved, because I would really miss that. You know, I'm now, and, you know, as it's not that I don't like sleeping in strangers' houses, but I'm definitely somebody that, you know, certainly as I've got older, prefers to sleep in a bed rather than on the floor. But otherwise, I love hanging out with people.
Yeah.
Like I think that, I don't know, sometimes I look at, there's two types of music. There's entertainment and performance, and that kind of comes with that, you know, the narrative of stardom and all of that. And then there's the other side, which is just people going around singing their feelings out or passing messages on through song. I've always seen myself more as that kind of artist. I love to play. I love to be in a musical environment, chatting with people. I love to get, you know, inquisitive as to how regions of countries and the world are different and where the overlaps are. And I feel that that's always been, you know, quite central to what I do. And sometimes I find it quite frustrating because it's, you know, it's marketed so heavily that it feels like it's a gimmick.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think a lot of singer-songwriters, that's their life and always has been and always will be. Like I'm certainly as at home. You know, I'm just about to go on tour supporting Deacon Blue and I'll be playing arenas, but I'm just as happy to be in the back room of a pub. Like, you know, I think the music is so often, it morphs with its environment. You do different shows depending on where you are. And I love that. I love that challenge. I love that flexibility. And also, you know, it was never really about like removing the myth or anything, because I literally don't see there being a myth. When you've been on tour and you've played a load of shows, you see people at all kinds of, you know, and all kinds of stages of the creative process. And therefore, you know, I don't really see it as a myth, and I see it more as like an extension of a lifestyle choice maybe, or, you know, part of a historic duty. Sounds a bit much and a bit pompous, but like that's what singer-songwriters do. They travel about. That's what keeps the songs fresh and new and interesting, and not just about building walls around you and closing yourself off. Like sometimes, you know, I believe in that kind of life as a participation sport. So always keen to, you know, meet and work with promoters and people that are taking chances and setting up things. And my musical life has been blessed as much by the weird and wonderful situations I found myself in, meeting people, as much as it has been from playing big stages and enjoying being an artist.
Going back to the technology behind this album and trying new things, it does feel like a really forward-thinking album. There's loads that goes into the production, samples, loops, tiny toy megaphones, the whole shebang is in here, which is maybe a slight point of difference to the other, let's use the term singer-songwriters that were doing the rounds in kind of those 2005, 2006, 2007. When you were making this album, did you feel like you were doing something that was different to the other music on the landscape at the time?
100%, and not in a way to be like, wow, I'm different, but just I a lot of my drive is to try and do something that sounds like me, and I have a wide range of influences and a wide range of things that I like. And it's, it was the same with Andy and Adam. We were listening to music that wasn't just played and written on acoustic guitars. I was touring in a scene that wasn't really acoustic guitars at all. And, I loved bands like Athlete and Gomez and the bravery of like mixing things up from parts of electronic and 70s world. I love Ronnie Sides, and I love, mixing up of beats and grooves and drum and bass, and that, in particular songs like Brown Paper Bag, where with the acoustic and the drum and bass screw sitting together. That's always something that I loved, and it's only increased my love for trying to do different things over time. I guess I'm less precocious in it. I think when I was younger, I was like, no, it has to be different. Now I'm quite happy to sit back a little bit if the occasion calls. But yeah, I've always believed that this is my space to set out my stall as to what it is that I want to do. And as a result, it meant that, some bits really worked and some bits don't work. And that's fine, because it's fluid. 15 years down the line, when you're performing live, you just shift out the bits that get in the way or turn the volume up on the bits that are different, and, still an unusual combination.
In terms of the lyrics of the album and the subject matter, it's always felt to me when I've listened to it quite a political album. And you say you were influenced by what was going on around you at the time. In spots, it certainly feels like almost an angry album. Do you see this as a protest album, or is it just that happens to be part of the picture that was your life at that particular period?
I think it's the gap between the feeling and the protest. That's where I see my political songs are sitting, in that moment where you initially felt, for me, the two most central things to my personal existence are class and race, whether I like it or not. I was born into a working class household as a British Asian in Southend. It's like, I think we're only starting to have big conversations about the overhangs and the impacts of that now. So, I would always feel sad or angry if there were things that would come into view that were now, with the modern language, issues of privilege or exclusivity or whatever. That would make me angry, and I needed to place it somewhere, and I wanted to place it somewhere positive, and that would be into music. So I think, my music is political because my life is political. I think that lots of people's lives are political because we're all products of our environment, and our environment is one that is political. It doesn't mean that everybody needs to write about that, but I'm much more comfortable talking about that than I am about feelings and stuff. So, it's the reaction of a 20-year-old British Asian from the punk scene and grew up in a working class house in Southend, like at the time, and even really now, like, for a demographic of 4 million people, British Asian people aren't really represented too much in indie world or acoustic world, or, for many times there was 2 or 3 people across a whole festival bill. And so not until that changes, I'll stop singing about it. But, we only need to look at what's going on at the moment in Yorkshire Cricket Club to know that there is serious implications into the way that this country is and has been. And my dream would be to not have to feel it. But I'm more aware that the best thing for me to do is to acknowledge it through song than it is to acknowledge it through resentment, because it's a product of something far more complex than just individual decision making. And, that's something that when I look back on that record, there's a few songs that I still play every gig where I'm like, that sentiment is important for me to keep it going and keep that. And I'm writing a new album at the moment where I'm actually kind of responding to some of these songs 15 years down the line.
Okay.
Because I really believe that there was a kind of, over the course of the pandemic, there was an emotional revolution of kinds, when it comes to issues of race and identity and patriarchal structures. And I feel like there was some ugly conversations that I didn't know the language for 15 years ago, and I do now. And it's kind of interesting to see how that anger has kind of moved or evolved, or where I've been able to separate isolating feelings from wider constructs. It's quite fascinating to think that I'm a political songwriter because I had no choice. I feel that that's quite a weird place to be. Like, the older I get, the more it's like, wow, okay, those songs were like real reflections on peripheral viewpoints that maybe hopefully don't exist so much now.
We might get to talk more about that in a moment, because I'm going to ask you to pick a couple of tracks off this album. I sometimes call them highlights, but they don't have to be highlights. They can be favorite songs. They can be songs with stories. They can be songs with memories attached to them. It's completely up to you. I just want you to pick a few that you want to talk about off this album. But there's a couple I want to talk about first, if that's okay. And they're the title tracks off the album. 2 tracks, Chronicles of a Bohemian Teenager Part 1 and Part 2. Now, it's always annoyed me slightly that Part 2 appears on the album before Part 1. And I think it's just my OCD kicking in, that I like things to be in order and I want 1 to be before 2. So why does 2 feature before 1 on the track listing?
1 was written before 2, so that's part of it. And 2, I always envisioned playing this album from beginning to end, and I knew that, you know, the album should end with ba 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 ba, you know, and I've only done it twice in the 15-year gap, so it's actually quite nice to, you know, it's like, if you want to talk about a slow build, it's a slow build right there. To be honest with you, the whole Chronicles of Bohemian Teenager thing was a bit tongue-in-cheek. Like, there were so many records in like the folk scene, punk, you know, adjacent folk scene that just had such ludicrous titles. I was like, what's the most ludicrous title I can give this record? And it was named after that song. You know, those song titles were getting out of control.
I was going to say, was that something you like to play with? Because the band name in itself, or your name, Get Cape, Where Cape Fly, is quite whimsical. You've got that track on there. I think might be the second to last track of the album. I'm probably going to get it wrong. If I had £1 for every song title, I'd be 30 short. So something, I forget.
That was Chronicles 4. That's why it's... But then I thought I can't have 1, 2, 4, because then people will ask me about 3. And it just, I think I clearly didn't put enough thought into what it might mean 15 years later. And that, you know, when you asked me earlier about regrets, actually, that's quite a big one. That it could have made my life a little bit easier.
Right. Pick me a couple of tracks off this album, Sam, that you either love or hate, or they just bring back memories from the making of this record.
Well, I love Chronicles 2. I think for me, that's a sweet spot of what it is that I was trying to do at this time. You know, it's kind of a bit folk, a bit punk, and a bit drum and bass. And, you know, that to me is like, people said, what's the Get Cape sound? It's like, you get most of it in that song. The other that's similar is Call Me Ishmael. You know, it kind of, I love how it shape shifts and it moves around. And it's really funny because I made my second album with an orchestra and everyone's like, he's working with an orchestra. Where's that come from? It's like, well, there's a whole string section in Chronicles 2, and there's a whole string and brass section in Call Me Ishmael. Yeah. So it was always there. It was never called an orchestra. I've always loved those sounds. Like, for me, what I loved about computers, and this really does bring it to tech back full circle, is that there were things that were possible to do then that aren't possible to do now. And then that's maybe why it wasn't about going to Rockfield, because I could sample strings and I could mash them up and do things that, you know, would have taken hours and thousands of pounds and, you know, loads of experience. And it was possible to just mess about with stuff in samplers on a computer and have the flexibility to see if it worked or not without taking ages. And, you know, those 2 songs to me typify certainly Ishmael lyrically and certainly Chronicles 2 musically, what, you know, Get Cape is to me anyway, and what it's supposed to be about, which is that it's a mashup. You know, it's a song that's written and played on a guitar, and then everything else is from a different world. And then it's just really the real challenge is trying to get it to all balance across an album. Those 2 are like, I could put them out tomorrow and be happy with both of them.
Given that your passion, particularly with this album, seemed to be kind of that pushing of technology, that combination of sounds, maybe drawing from dance music and bringing it to indie. What was the thinking behind Once More with Feeling being the opening track of the album, which is... It's got this kind of really beautiful, almost Spanish acoustic guitar intro. It's quite stripped back compared to the rest of the album.
Yeah, super fast. That's one where I was like, wow, okay, I did not let any of those breathe. That's definitely like early 2000s, isn't it? It's like fingerpick songs. It was a race to get to the end almost. I like albums that start with an opening chapter and a closing chapter.
Right.
Also, by this point, I think a good half of the record had already been established. We'd put 4 tracks out on an EP, 2 had come out, a couple had found their way into the set. And I like a song that looks into an abject future because it allows you to then later on look back. This sounds like a strange thing to say, but I like talking before songs sometimes.
Right.
I think if you've got songs in your catalogue that allow you to say what you want to say in the present, and I think that song being first it sets the tone. It sets the tone that mostly it's an angry bum out album, but the hope is that it will change. I think that what I do well, or what I enjoy to do the most, is be on the beginnings of the up curve.
Okay.
I tend to write songs that kind of have that feel melancholy, but lyrically they're kind of turning a corner. And I think that it's important therefore to have either a concluding statement or something that sums the whole thing up at the beginning of a record. And sonically it's just a nice way to kind of lull people into a false sense of security that was going to be a pleasant indie acoustic record.
Is there another track you'd like to highlight off this album?
Well, I really like Whitewash's Brainwash. That's another song that I feel that we were kind of switching it up and it's a bit more garagey when we play it live now. But it's interesting. It moves. It's got a quite unusual shape. I like the guitar part. I think it's funny because I think some people know me for my singles and some people know me for my album tracks, and there doesn't really seem to be any overlap in the middle. And weirdly, they're often quite different. So it's nice to have a song like that kind of is still quite hooky, but what you'd call more an album track than a single in terms of its structure and its, it brings in some of the acoustic, elements, but also it mashes up some electronic. The bass line's a bit more atypical of what you'd expect for a song that moves like that. So that's a song that, lyrically, weirdly, annoyingly holds up as well. When you write kind of direct, addressed political songs, you kind of think that things will change. But yeah, Whitewash is definitely one that, feels like it's something that I'd happily put out tomorrow.
It's brilliant to hear you talking about a couple of your tracks. We're going to hear the views of someone else, so I hope that's okay. We're going to talk about reviews. I've done a few of these long players now, and I quite like to dig back into the reviews of albums from magazines and music publications. And what I've noticed that in the early noughties, there was a horrible habit from the music press to be deliberately sneering and deliberately negative. And I don't think you 100% escaped that.
My second album got savaged. It was almost felt like a takedown. It was like 2 months. It was like the worst 2 months I've ever had in my life. It's just, you just feel like you're getting ripped apart. I'm glad that culture's changed. I think it's awesome that people are allowed to like and dislike stuff, but it's way less personal attacks.
Well, you call it trolling nowadays, wouldn't you? I think in the modern culture of social media, the trolls are still there, but the trolls aren't getting paid X amount a week to write music reviews. That's the kind of subtle difference now. So to go back, I don't want to go over old wounds, but the allmusic.com, so the words were that they used, not particularly different from the other vaguely introspective young singer-songwriters out there, with his plaintive, often monotonous and sometimes whiny vocals and simple acoustic guitar chords, it can get a little repetitive. Firstly, I'm not sure they actually listened to the album, but secondly, you're 20 years old, you've just released your debut album. Does that hit you hard? Or are you able to come over it with the arrogance of youth and it just makes you even more determined to succeed?
To be honest, ones like that where it's like, the guitar playing's not very developed or whatever, it's like, well, no, it's like not, and that's not an arrogant thing, that's just years of practice. Yeah, cool, like sounds like everything else, super whiny. That's fine if that's what they think, but thankfully lots of other people didn't think like that, and I didn't think like that. Those ones I don't mind. It's always ones where it's about lyrics that I find difficult, because I totally get that I've got a slightly whiny Essex accent, and my finger picking's flat picking and not the kind of more beautiful style. Like, I get all of that stuff. Like, that's all points of difference, and people are totally valid. It's when people go, lyrics are bad or lyrics are naive. They're the ones that do my head in.
You know what? 60,000 copies sold early doors, went silver early as well. Best solo artist at the NME Awards. I think you probably proved them all wrong. I think you probably did all right out of it.
Well, it's wild. I was randomly playing a show in Leicester and I found out it went gold about 2 years ago. And I was like, this is bonkers. People must still be listening to it regularly. And sometimes you look at Spotify statistics and you think, this is just clever playlisting from a label to try and make a bit of extra cash. But it really does seem like people are listening to it. And I don't know, accolades don't really bother me so much. What bothers me is the ability to carry on doing this because I love it. And, you know, the fact that people are listening to the album and it meant something to people is much more of a reward. I think one of the things that was bad about that culture is that not all music is for everyone. And I think that now we've got a lot more scope and scale in terms of understanding that different, you know, I guess there was a rush to ubiquity at that point because everything was still through traditional channels. The internet wasn't really a thing. iTunes didn't exist when this album came out. You know, neither did YouTube. So it's now you can find things that's more niche. You know, if you're only into dark wave or you're only into super minimal tech, you can find the places that will review the records that you would like and the sources of where to purchase them from or where to get recommendations. And I think that we've always had a great culture in it in the UK and radio because you can hear people's enthusiasm and you can't fake it. But we certainly in the early 2000s had a wobble in the press in terms of it almost felt more like at times like racketeering than it did actually honest reviewing. And to me, the best reviews are always in a record shop. And, you know, that's one of the things I'm super grateful of with this album. I have to go to loads of in stores or record shops and see the record out in the wild in the place that it was designed to be.
Sam, brilliant to chat to you. I've really enjoyed talking to you about Chronicles of a Bohemian Teenager and personally going back to rediscover this album because it's been a long time since I listened to it right the way through. That's been a joy as well. So really appreciate your time on the XS Long Player. In terms of what you're doing now and the tour that you've got coming up, like I say, we're recording this interview November of 2021. Are there still tickets available for the anniversary tour that's happening next year?
Yeah, so it moved to March and April. There's a few tickets left in most of the cities. And yeah, we're going to be playing the album in full with a full band, you know, full horn section. So it's going to be fun. You know, it's going to be a mixture of a faithful representation of the album, but it's also going to have 15 years of joyful musical experience and great people alongside it. And loads of great venues. Just really looking forward to kind of seeing what everyone looks like 15 years on.
And in terms of new stuff, what's around the corner?
So I'm actually recording this interview from the studio at the moment. I'm 3/4 of the way through a new album recording. Maybe end of next year, hopefully.
Good to hear, man. Really nice to speak to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
The XS Manchester Long Player, an iconic album in full with Jim Salveson. XS Manchester.
Boom! We're done for another episode of the XS Long Player. We have one more episode to go. If you're listening to these in real time when they're released, before we're going to take a little break. So while we're on a break, make sure you are subscribed and following this series. So when we do start up again, you get a little notification. You get to know when we will be releasing more episodes, more classic albums discussed with the people that made them. There's loads more in this series to go at as well. You can listen to the last episode I did before this, which was Oasis, Definitely Maybe, that album. I spoke to Alan Miggy about that. I really liked the chat with Pigeon Detectives about their debut. The Badly Drawn Boy one is a good one as well, as he talks me through Hour of the Wildebeest. In fact, you know what? They're all good. Go and listen to them all. And if you like what you hear, please do leave a review in Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps people find this show and it helps spread the word. So if you're not going to go out and tell your mates or knock on your neighbour's door and tell them how good the XS Long Player is, just do a review instead. Dead simple. Right, I'll be back very soon with another episode of the XS Long Player. Take care.
Manchester's indie rock and roll station, XS Manchester.